Let's talk about externalities. Externalities are examples of market failures where Adam Smith's invisible hand does not incentivize consumers and business people to take actions that are in the best interest of society. Governments, as we will see, can improve the functioning of markets by taking into account externalities, but politicians themselves don't have optimal incentives to correct externalities. There are two kinds of externalities, negative externalities and positive externalities. A negative externality is a cost paid by people other than the buyer and seller of a good. Pollution is the most important example of negative externality. So imagine my factory pollutes. The pollution doesn't harm my customers very much and doesn't harm me very much, but imposes massive costs on people who live in the community of my factory. I don't have an incentive to care about what the factory is doing, and my consumers don't have an incentive either. So I'll end up producing too much pollution and probably end up producing too much of the good that creates the pollution. Again, a negative externality is a cost paid by people other than the buyer or seller of a good. A positive externality is a benefit received by people other than the buyer and seller of a good. So imagine my factory happens to be extraordinarily beautiful, and my customers never see my factory. Most of the benefit of my factory's visual appeal goes to people who live in the surrounding community, who get to see what a fantastic factory it is. I don't have an incentive to care about that, and my consumers don't have an incentive to buy my product because my factory is so beautiful. Imagine there's two kinds of gas you can put in your car, leaded gas and unleaded gas. And there's two differences. Unleaded gas costs a little bit more, so it's a little expensive to take out the lead from someone's gas. The other difference is that leaded gas, if you use it in your car, you'll increase the amount of lead in the atmosphere, and it'll very slightly lower the IQ of all of the children in your city. Now, it'll lower it by a really, really tiny amount, if from just you driving. So, even if you have kids, it's not a big deal. The extra harm to your kids' IQ from you using leaded versus unleaded gas is trivial. It's absolutely tiny. Now, of course, if there are thousands or millions of people in your city who drive, and they all use leaded gas, well, yeah, your kids will be noticeably less intelligent than they otherwise would be. So driving with leaded gas, that creates a negative externality. And unfortunately, it's not in the interest of any one person or any one firm to do anything about it. Because if you're thinking of driving, you say, gee, should I have leaded or unleaded gas? Well, the unleaded gas is more expensive. And in terms of what's best for my family, well, the extra effect of just me using leaded gas is tiny. So you're better off saving the money and going with leaded gas. Now, if all consumers think this way, everyone uses leaded gas, and our kids are considerably dumber, and that means, we'll be poorer and our quality of life will be lower. So this is how Adam Smith's invisible hand can fail us, because of this externality of leaded gas. Notice, if all of the harm of your using leaded gas went to your own kids' brains or to your brain, then there wouldn't be this externality. You would measure the harm caused by the lead. You compare that to the cost savings of using leaded gas, and you'd probably make a rational choice. But if you get all of the cost benefits of using leaded gas, but almost all of the harm, well over 99.999% of the harm goes to other people, now you're going to make a bad decision in terms of what's in the best interest of society, and you'll use too much leaded gas. Adam Smith's invisible hand is not causing you to take into account the harm of the negative externality of leaded gas. And this frequently happens with negative externalities. When a product has a negative externality, people will tend to use more of it than is socially optimal. Now let's discuss 5 ways that the government can reduce the harm of pollution from leaded gas or from any other type of pollution negative externality. One path the government can take is to simply ban a pollutant. And most rich countries have done this with leaded gas, and it's been wonderful. Sure, there is some cost to banning leaded gas. People have to switch to the slightly more expensive unleaded gas, but the benefit in terms of having smarter children is probably vastly outweighed that. So this is an excellent thing. Interestingly, even people who, if they could, would use leaded gas should support this policy. You might say, gee, if it was legal to use leaded gas, I would do it, but I still would favor my congressman voting to ban leaded gasoline. Part of the reason this has worked is because unleaded gas is a great substitute for leaded gas. It's not a perfect substitute. It costs a bit more, but still it's a fairly good substitute. Unfortunately, this policy of banning the pollutant, it's not going to work across the board. I mean, if governments tried to ban every single pollutant, well, they would kill most people. Agriculture requires a bit of pollution. Almost all human activities require pollution, and if we were to try to ban all pollution, the Earth might be able to support a few million of us, which would be quite bad for the rest of mankind. So it makes sense to ban a pollutant if it has really of absolutely no value, or if there's a really good substitute that's just a little bit more expensive but is much less harmful to the environment, as in the case with leaded gas. Otherwise, banning pollutants, you can't do that. You would impose a lot more harm. So what else could the government do? The main approach used in the United States is what's called command and control. This is where the government, and often the Environmental Protection Agency, will tell companies how they can pollute. So if you're an American company and you want to build a factory that's going to emit some pollutants, you've got to get approval of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. They'll tell you how much you can pollute, what pollution reducing technology you can use, where you can locate, what changes you have to make as new technology comes on board. This is why in the United States, the EPA is one of the most powerful government agencies, because so much industry can only survive if it pollutes. And so these agencies are required to get the continual approval of the EPA to exist. Now, unfortunately, there's no magic Adam Smith invisible hand-like process that causes the EPA to make the right decisions. How do they know how much of pollutants should be emitted by what factories and what pollution reducing technologies different factories should use? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of engineers and well-meaning people there, and they, some of them at least do their best, but how do we know they'll get it right? How do we know they share the environmental values of the rest of the country? Also, how do we know that they're not going to be corrupt? I mean, and it doesn't have to be corrupt and they're accepting, bribes from business people. It could be, corrupt. Like, imagine like this. Imagine normally someone works for 20 years at the EPA, then they leave and they get a job in an industry. And it's in an industry that the EPA, regulates. So think of your incentive structure. Gee, I'll work for the EPA for 20 years, regulating an industry. Then after 20 years, I'll leave the EPA and I'll hopefully get a job at the industry where they'll pay me a lot of money. Well, chances are the industry won't hire you if you've been really mean to them. And the industry can say, well, we'll have this policy of we'll hire friendly EPA officials and we'll pay them very large salaries after they leave the EPA if they've been nice to us. So now no one's ever paying anyone a direct bribe. No one ever has to mention this arrangement. It can just be obvious to everybody. And things like this can happen all the time. Or another way the EPA can be corrupt is, the EPA is dependent on its budget on congressmen and senators. So you can imagine, say, there's a factory owner that contributes to try to defeat the re-election of a powerful senator. So the senator is very mad at the factory owner. You can imagine the senator calls up the head of the EPA, hey, this factory, I think they're polluting too much. Shut them down. Make sure, it's really hard for them to expand, or make them adopt really expensive pollution-reducing technologies. The EPA, which is dependent upon Congress to survive, for a budget, for raises, they're going to listen to the senator. So now, if you're running a factory, you have to be afraid of angering a senator, because if you anger the senator could call the EPA and you'll be in big trouble. So it's very tough. If you give a lot of power over industry to a government agency, there's going to be lots of different types of corruption. That's unavoidable. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that we should have no control over how much factories pollute. That could cause even more harm. There's that, but fortunately, there's some sort of market-friendly mechanisms that can do a better job sometimes in command and control. Let's talk about one now. A Peruvian tax is a tax on pollution, and it was thought up by an economist, Arthur Pegu. So here's a simple model of how it works. Let's say every time I make a widget, I create $2 worth of pollution harm. And it's a negative externality. I don't care about it. My consumers don't care about it. Peruvian tax would say, okay, now whenever you create a widget, you have to pay a $2 tax, which is equal to the harm of the pollution you caused. Well, what the Peruvian tax does is it internalizes the externality. Again, a Peruvian tax internalizes the externality. I normally don't care about the harm of the pollution I'm causing. But if suddenly I have to pay a tax equal to the harm of the pollution I'm causing, well, I certainly care about that harm now, and I have an incentive to reduce it. If I have to pay a Peruvian tax on for every widget I make, I have an incentive to produce fewer widgets or to figure out how to make widgets that create less pollution. A Peruvian tax is great for encouraging innovation. Imagine someone comes up with an innovation that allows me to make widgets creating less pollution. I'm willing to pay a person money for this innovation if it would lower the Peruvian taxes I'm paying. This doesn't necessarily apply under a command and control economy. If the EPA is telling me, you make widgets, you must use this pollution reducing technology, I have no incentive to innovate and come up with better technologies. And other people don't have incentives to come up with better technologies either, because who's going to pay them for it? But if a Peruvian tax is in place where I'm assessed a tax equal to the harm of the pollution negative externalities, now I have an incentive to reduce that harm. I have an incentive to pay other people who can figure out how to reduce that harm. But a Peruvian tax isn't a magical fix, because how do you get the level of a tax right? I mean, sure, in my example, I can say every widget costs $2 of harm to society, and if you use this device, it would be $180. But there's no magical way of measuring that. So you're still going to need something like the EPA to get the right level of Peruvian taxation. And you can bet companies will be complaining to senators if they think the level is too high, and senators will try to get a high level on industries that don't donate to their campaigns. So there's still going to be corruption. There's still going to be information issues. But the Peruvian tax is a little bit easier. You don't have to figure out how every single factory needs to be regulated once you come up with, or if you can come up with sort of an objective way of measuring the harm of various pollutants. Another market-friendly mechanism for reducing pollution is what's called tradable permits. Let me explain tradable permits in terms of students turning in papers late. Let's say I have a large class, and I have students who will be turning in their papers right before Christmas. And I don't mind if, say, 4 students turn their papers in late. That doesn't bother me. I want to get the papers done before Christmas, but if only 4 or fewer, that's okay. But if a lot of students do, that's just a real pain for me. Now, what approaches could I take? Well, the normal thing professors do is basically command and control. You tell them, students, oh, you can't turn papers in late no matter what, but that never works. Student, my grandmother died, I have this really serious disease, or I have all these other tests, or, I'm crying a lot, and because I'm crying so much, please give me an extension. So, professors have to deal with that, and it is a major pain. But imagine a tradable permit system. What the professor does is it says, okay, I'm going to issue 4 lateness permits, and I will auction off these permits, to the whole class. Whoever bids the most The four people who bid the most get this lateness permit. And if you have a lateness permit, you can turn in your paper 1 day late. And, say the professor's not corrupt, so he's going to give the money to the college. Now, once a student has a lateness permit, she has the right to turn the paper in late, or she could sell it to a classmate. So if you buy a lateness permit because you think you'll be late, but then you're not, you can sell it to someone else who is late. Now, the analogy with pollution is the EPA would issue tradable permits to emit a certain amount of a pollutant. So if, say, pollutant X, say to emit 100 tons of pollutant X, you need a one certificate. And for every certificate you have, you legally have the right to emit 100 units of this pollutant. Now, the EPA would initially auction off the permits, and the people who placed the greatest value on polluting would get them. But then they could sell them. There'd be a secondary market for the permits, and that's a great thing because that encourages innovation. Because if somebody can figure out a way of causing me to pollute less, well, then I won't need as many permits. I can sell my old permits. I'll pay money for this innovation. An advantage of the tradable permit system is that the EPA could set the total amount of each pollutant that can be emitted. So it says, okay, we think every year it's okay for in the United States for this much of this dioxide, whatever, to be emitted. So we'll issue that many permits, we'll auction them off, and then we'll let people trade them in a secondary market. And then you get to see the price the permits trade at, and this tells you something about how much the market values that type of pollution. If the market values that type of pollution a lot, maybe the EPA will say, well, gee, there's probably tremendous economic value for creating this type of pollutant, we'll allow more of it. While if the market doesn't have a very high price in the secondary market, the EPA might cut back in subsequent years. Also, environmentalists could buy up the tradable permits and just not use them. If environmentalists think, we think there's too much of this pollutant being emitted, they just buy up the tradable permits and keep them. Another advantage of tradable permits, along with Peruvian taxes, is it's a way of raising revenue for governments. Most taxes are wealth destroying. In order for the government to raise $100 of wealth, it usually ends up destroying more than that among its citizens. So, maybe citizens lose $130 of wealth, government gains $100. But the Peruvian tax and tradable permits, these are actually wealth creating. So these are ways governments can get money while making the economy more efficient. So this is another big advantage to them. Now, of course, with everything else, you're still going to have an issue of corruption. Somebody has to decide how many tradable permits to issue for each pollutant, and you can bet there'll be a lot of lobbying. Businesses will be nicer to bureaucrats and politicians that favor their industry. So this isn't a magic cure-all, but it would involve a lot lighter regulation than a command and control system would. The final way that governments could potentially reduce pollution is what I'm going to call the Coase theorem, and this is basically having governments do nothing. Now, Ronald Coase was a very famous economist, and he came up with the idea that if transaction costs are sufficiently low, people should be able to negotiate to get rid of externalities. So let me give you a simple example. Let's say you're living in a dorm and someone's playing the music really loudly, and that person likes hearing the music really loudly, but it annoys the crap out of you. That loud music is a negative externality. Now, you don't need the government to solve the problem. Sure, the government could come in. It could ban loud music. It could tax the music. It could say, you've got to buy a permit to play loud music, and we'll only give permits for 2 hours a day. But the Coase theorem would say, if you two can negotiate, you can work it out. Maybe this person derives enormous benefit from playing the music really loudly. And, you talk to them, you're like, I didn't realize you've got this medical condition. You need to have loud music to be alive. Well, I guess you're going to play the music really loudly. But maybe, it's the opposite. Maybe you really hate the loud music. So you can go up to the person and say, please don't turn it very loud, and you plead with them. Or you could even use money. Money is a great way of, negotiating. You could say, look, please turn the music down. And they said, no, I'm sorry, I don't want to. I think I have a right to play it loudly. I think you're being unreasonable. So you're like, okay, how about this? I'll give you $10 a week if you don't play the music very loud. If they think it's worth it, they'll accept. When there's a negative externality, there are people being harmed. If the people being harmed can negotiate with the people doing the harming, then they should be able to work out their problems in an efficient way. Now, Ronald Coase didn't think, negotiations would always work. He just thought they would work if transaction costs are low enough. So, for example, if my pollution harms 1 million people, well, 1 million people are not going to be able to get together and negotiate with me. And maybe the person playing the loud music is not trustworthy. She'll say, oh, sure, $10, and I'll stop for a month. You pay the $10. 3 minutes later, the music is very loud again. She's like, oh, yeah, I need another $10. Well, someone being dishonest, that's a transaction cost. But, frequently when there's a negative externality, people, they can negotiate. They can overcome the problem. And this is how you can use economics in your life. If someone's doing something that harms you, and if you think the harm to you is greater than the benefit they're receiving, at least in terms of dollars, negotiate with them. If you think, put a dollar amount, you think, gee, I would pay $20 for the person not to be doing this annoying thing. And you say, you know what? I bet they would accept $10 not to do that annoying thing. Well, the Coase theorem is saying go up and offer the person $10 not to do that annoying thing. You'll be better off and they'll be better off. This only works if you can talk to them and you can trust them, but that happens in a lot of situations. All right, let's talk about global warming. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware, most scientists think that human activity is gradually raising the temperature of the Earth, and this could get very bad. This could impose, extremely large costs on mankind, especially in the very long run. Now, I want to take the science as a given. I don't know enough about the science of global warming to know whether that's true or not. It's a very politicized issue, which makes me suspicious. Of course, that doesn't mean that it isn't true. It just means that me as an outsider to a climate scientist, I can't know the truth. But let's just, accept that, human-caused activities is creating global warming, and there's a decent chance this is going to be very, very bad and in the next century impose massive costs on our species. What can we do? Well, let's go through the 5 things we've discussed. One is ban all pollution, ban all global warming gases. No, that wipes out our species. I mean, maybe there'd be like a few thousand of us left, but no, we kind of need to create pollution that causes global warming if we're going to survive. Okay, second, command and control. This is a tough one. The problem with global warming is that this is a global externality. So any one country could definitely use command and control to significantly reduce the amount of global warming gases it emits. The United States could do it, European Union, Japan, China. But it's unfortunately, there's no world body capable of imposing command and control on everyone. And it's actually worse than that. The United States taking action to reduce the amount of global warming gases it emits would actually cause China to emit more global warming gases, not out of spite or anything, just basic economics. I mean, for example, if the United States cuts back on how much coal we burn, well, what does that do? That lowers the demand for coal, which lowers the price, which means other people will use more of it. Or let's say the United States, we use command and control and we say our factories have to be more fuel efficient. Our factories have to emit less global warming gases. Okay, well, that's going to raise the price of our products. Now, our government can make Americans pay more for those products. But what if, let's say there was this factory used to supply Mexico with product. But now the Mexicans are like, wait a minute, the Chinese factories are now better able to make this good for us because they don't have these extra environmental regulations. So China is now producing more of this good. Now, the United States overall is more energy efficient per unit of economic output than China. That's part of the reason the United States is so much richer. So if, the United States becoming, having to adopt more global warming friendly policies causes other countries to buy more Chinese goods, that will cause greater levels of global warming. In more economic terms, if some countries seriously restrict how much their manufacturers can, how much global warming gases their manufacturers can create, that's going to cause there to be a comparative advantage in countries that don't regulate global warming gases in producing very dirty products. And they'll produce more of these products, which will undercut the efforts to reduce global warming by just a few countries. So command and control, unfortunately, because of the international nature of global warming, won't work as well. Now, tradable permits and Peruvian taxes, for that to work, you also probably need a worldwide body. I mean, maybe that could happen. Maybe the United States, China, Europe, India, Africa gets together and says, all right, we'll do a tradable permit. Will be a tradable permit or Peruvian tax system. That could work, but it's going to be difficult for all the countries to go along. The Coase theorem is hopeless because there's just too many parties to negotiate, for everyone to negotiate. The major problem of global warming is that rich countries care a lot more about it than poor countries do. Generally, the environment is a normal good. The richer you get, the more you care about it. So countries like China and India, they'd be quite willing to reduce how many global warming gases they produce if rich countries were to give them hundreds of billions of dollars a year. Well, politically, that really isn't going to work. It's very unlikely, for example, that the Republican Party in the United States would allow the United States government to give hundreds of billions of dollars to the Chinese Communist Party. And if the Democrats got in power and did that, then, this would be the major issue in the next election. China and India have atomic weapons. There's really no way the rest of the world is going to force them to admit less global warming gases. So bribing these countries, having to give them sufficient amount of money, that politically won't work. Military force won't work, and probably an atomic war to stop global warming is not going to be good for the environment. So I am pessimistic, with the one exception of innovation. It might be that solar power, gets cheap enough that's sort of naturally ends up solving a lot of the problem. I don't know enough about the solar power industry to know if that's realistic. But the Earth, our political system on Earth doesn't seem to be up to dealing with global warming, and that could end up being very bad for us. When we talk about governments and the environment, I think it's important to discuss ways that governments actively make the environment worse. I mean, there are definitely market failures when it comes to the environment, and governments have done some very good things correcting these market failures. But governments have also made the situation much worse, so it's important to get a balanced perspective with respect to the government. A big one is actually subsidizing pollution-generating activities. So, with mining and logging, there's environmental costs to that. So the economic answer is, government should restrict it. You should tax it or regulate it. But often the miners and loggers, they're politically powerful. They actually get the government to give them extra money. So instead of saying, oh, we'll tax you for every tree you cut down or for every, unit of metal you dig up out of the ground, they get the government to give them money. And this happens throughout the world. So governments throughout the world are doing the exact opposite. They're putting basically a negative Peruvian tax on lots of pollution-generating activities where they're paying industry money. They're encouraging them to pollute more because the polluting industries are politically powerful and they've managed to get the government to subsidize their activities. So economists are really good at figuring out what the ideal government would do to correct an externality. We've got lots of theories, there's lots of math, but we don't have any hope, any reason to think that any government would actually do this. Politicians act in their own self-interest. Their self-interest tends not to be reading economic journals. Oh, this is the function that tells me how I should regulate the logging industry. No, it's wait. The logging industry gives me this much money a year if I support them, but if I don't support them, they'll give that money to my opponent. I think I'll ignore all those economic journal articles and I'll support the logging industry and let them, pollute more. That's the way the world is. Let me end this video on an optimistic note by talking about the most important externality, and that's the positive externality of innovation. Innovation is coming up with new ways of doing things. So you can imagine businesses operate by formulas. They make widgets. If you innovate, you come up with a better formula. It makes widgets that are cheaper or it makes higher quality widgets. Most of the wealth that we have in our world today actually comes from the positive externalities of innovation, right? The products you buy, your refrigerator, your stove, your computer, those were invented a long time ago. And when you bought the product, none of that money went to the original inventor. And of course, if you go far back enough, you pencil, the compass. I mean, those people created things that have benefited you, and you certainly didn't do anything to help them. So an enormous amount of wealth in today's world has come through the positive externality of innovation. Now, unfortunately, though, because there's such a strong positive externality to innovation, there's less innovation than is socially optimal. If you come up with a great new product, you'll capture some of the benefit, but you won't capture all of it. That means Adam Smith's invisible hand is not pushing you as hard as it would socially optimally be for you to innovate. Still, though, innovation is a fantastic thing, and there seems to be a lot of people who want to innovate even though they don't capture most or even a significant amount of their innovation. And innovation is likely to continually make us richer, and is the reason why in 50 years I think there's a decent chance, if we don't destroy our civilization, that people will be vastly richer than we are today on average. Thank you.